You've seen the pictures, the iconic Tower of London, a 1,000-year-old fortress standing guard over the city. Tourists flock to see the crown jewels and the famous beefeater guards. But beneath the polished stone and tourist smiles lies a chilling secret. For certain women in history, this royal palace was not a sanctuary. It was the end of the line. It was a purpose-built stage for state-sanctioned murder. 4 high-born women, including 2 queens of England, walked through these gates believing their status would protect them. They were wrong. Behind these walls, they were systematically isolated, psychologically broken, and ultimately executed by the very men who had promised them power and protection. This isn't just a story about a historic building. It's a story about the monarchy's ultimate betrayal, and I'm about to reveal how this world-famous landmark became a stone-cold killer, and why the ghosts of these women have a terrifying warning for us today. To understand what happened, you have to stop thinking of the tower as just a prison. Think of it as a weapon. In the brutal, high-stakes game of Tudor politics, the Tower of London was the ultimate tool of psychological warfare. If a king or queen needed to send a message, they didn't just issue a statement. They staged an execution, but there were 2 types of executions. The common criminals and rebels were killed publicly on Tower Hill in front of roaring, bloodthirsty crowds. But for the elite, for queens, countesses, and rivals with royal blood, the monarchy had a special, private venue, a quiet patch of grass inside the walls called Tower Green. This was VIP treatment for the damned. An execution here wasn't a public spectacle. It was a carefully controlled message sent to the inner circle of power. It was the 16th century equivalent of a corporation burying a scandal or a political party silencing a dissident. It was clean, efficient, and utterly terrifying. Before we meet the first woman dragged into this nightmare, let me ask you, have you ever felt like a pawn in someone else's game? Comment "pawn" below if you know that feeling of being completely out of control of your own destiny. Her name was Lady Jane Grey, and she is perhaps history's most tragic queen. She was brilliant, devout, and at just 16 years old, she had a mind that rivaled scholars twice her age. But her intelligence wouldn't save her. It only made her a more valuable piece in a deadly political chess match she never asked to play. When the young King Edward II died in 1553, a group of powerful Protestant nobles, led by the ambitious John Dudley, panicked. The next in line was the fiercely Catholic Mary Tudor, and they knew her rise to power meant their fall. So, they cooked up a scheme to bypass her, and they chose Jane as their puppet queen. She had a distant claim to the throne, and more importantly, she was a Protestant they believed they could control. Contemporary accounts say that when they told Jane she was to be queen, she didn't celebrate. She collapsed, weeping. She knew it was a death sentence. Her parents and her manipulative father-in-law, Dudley, coerced her into accepting. For 9 days, she was the Queen of England. But the English people saw the plot for what it was, a coup. They rallied behind the rightful heir, Mary Tudor. Jane's reign ended as quickly as it began, and her reward for being a dutiful daughter was a one-way trip to the Tower of London. Initially, Queen Mary was hesitant to execute her teenage cousin, but a rebellion in Jane's name sealed her fate. On the cold morning of February 12, 1554, Jane was led out to Tower Green. She was dressed in a simple black gown, clutching a prayer book. There was no screaming crowd, only a handful of silent, watchful witnesses. She spoke calmly from the scaffold, admitting that while she was innocent of seeking the crown, she was guilty under the law. She asked the onlookers to pray for her. Then the executioner knelt to ask for her forgiveness, which she gave. He tied a blindfold over her eyes, plunging her into total darkness. And in that moment, the composure of the 16-year-old girl finally broke. Trembling, she reached out into the void, her hands unable to find the executioner's block. A voice, filled with the panic of a lost child, cried out, "What shall I do? Where is it?" A chilling silence hung in the air. For a moment, no one moved. Finally, an onlooker stepped forward and guided her hands to the wooden block. Moments later, the axe fell. England's 9-day queen was gone. Jane's death was a tragedy of innocence lost. But what happens when the victim isn't so innocent in the eyes of the king? What happens when a queen is accused of the ultimate betrayal? The story of Henry VIII's next victim is even more scandalous. Enter Catherine Howard. If Jane Grey was a pawn, Catherine was a prize, and then a liability. In 1540, the aging King Henry VIII, now in his late 40s, morbidly obese, and tormented by a foul-smelling ulcer on his leg, laid eyes on the vibrant, charming teenager. She was barely 17. He was instantly obsessed. He called her his rose without a thorn. After the disaster of his fourth marriage, she was his youthful escape. But let's reframe this. This wasn't a royal romance. It was a deeply disturbing case of exploitation. Think of a powerful, predatory CEO grooming a young intern who doesn't understand the dangerous world she's just entered. Catherine was raised in a loose household with little guidance and had a history of youthful flirtations. She was fun, charming, and tragically unprepared for the viper's nest of the Tudor court. She didn't realize that her past wasn't her own anymore. It was a weapon, just waiting to be used against her. Section 6. Beheaded for being human. It didn't take long for the whispers to start. Courtiers who knew of her past came forward, and soon, allegations surfaced of infidelity during her marriage to the king. When Henry was told, his adoration curdled into murderous rage. Catherine was arrested and interrogated. She was never given a formal trial. Her fate was decided in the king's chambers, fueled by his wounded pride. On February 13, 1542, less than 2 years after becoming queen, Catherine Howard was taken to the same spot on Tower Green where Jane Grey would later die. She was just a girl, maybe 19 years old, forced to pay the ultimate price for her own naivety and the king's bruised ego. Later accounts claim she said, "I die a queen, but I would rather die the wife of Culpeper," the man she was accused of loving. While likely a myth, that quote captures the heart of her tragedy. She was a girl trapped in a role she never understood, killed not for treason, but for being human. This is where it gets really dark. Do you think a person's past should be used to destroy their future? Drop a yes or no in the comments. I'm curious what you think, but not every woman who faced the tower was a political pawn or a naive girl. Some were warriors. Meet Anne Askew. She wasn't royalty, but a well-educated gentlewoman with a dangerously sharp mind and an unbreakable spirit. Her crime wasn't treason or adultery, it was thinking for herself. In a time of violent religious turmoil, Anne was a passionate Protestant preacher. She openly challenged the Catholic doctrines that Henry VIII's conservative faction was pushing. Her intelligence and defiance made her a massive threat. Powerful men couldn't stand being challenged by a woman, so they decided to crush her. In 1546, she was arrested and taken to the Tower, where they subjected her to something no other woman of her rank had ever endured there: torture on the rack. They were desperate for her to name other Protestant reformers at court, but Anne refused. The king's own Lord Chancellor was so enraged by her defiance that he allegedly put his own hands to the wheel, stretching her body until her joints were dislocated. They broke her body, but they never broke her will. She gave them no names. Permanently crippled, Anne couldn't walk to her own execution. She had to be carried to the stake in a chair, but she died undefeated, a martyr for the right to her own beliefs. The final story is perhaps the most horrifying and the one most often forgotten. Margaret Pole was royalty. She was the daughter of a prince and one of the last surviving members of the Plantagenet dynasty, the family the Tudors had overthrown to seize power. By 1541, she was nearly 70 years old, a survivor who had outlasted kings, but to the pathologically paranoid Henry VIII, her bloodline made her a living threat. Her son, a cardinal in Rome, had publicly denounced the king. Since Henry couldn't get his hands on the son, he did the next best thing. He arrested his elderly mother. She was held in the Tower for over 2 years without a trial. On May 27, 1541, she was told she was going to be executed. With incredible courage, she refused to lay her head on the block, declaring that she was no traitor. What followed was a scene of pure butchery. The executioner, described as inexperienced, missed her neck, gashing her shoulder instead. Margaret, according to legend, fought back. It took multiple horrific blows with the axe to kill her. It wasn't an execution, it was a bloody, chaotic spectacle of terror. It was Henry VIII's ultimate message. No one, not even an old woman with royal blood, was safe from his paranoia. So what do we take away from these 4 horrific stories? Let me leave you with 4 life-changing lessons that were forged in the blood-soaked ground of the Tower. First, power doesn't just corrupt, it reveals. The Tudor monarchy had absolute power, and it revealed a deep-seated brutality. They used the ultimate tool of the state not to protect their people, but to eliminate women who became inconvenient. Second, your identity can be your death sentence. Jane was executed for her bloodline, Catherine for her past, Anne for her beliefs, Margaret for her lineage. They were killed not for what they did, but for who they were. Third, the narrative is always controlled by the victors. In the official records, these women were condemned as traitors, heretics, and adulterers. The Crown wrote the story that served its interests. It's only now that we can piece together the truth of their injustice. Fourth, and most importantly, innocence is never a shield against power. Being innocent of a crime was irrelevant. The moment these women became a political liability, their fate was sealed. Justice had nothing to do with it. It's easy to dismiss this as ancient history, a brutal chapter from a distant past, but it's not. It's a timeless warning about the nature of power. The tools have changed, but the game remains the same. Today, power doesn't use an axe. It uses a media smear campaign. It doesn't use the tower. It uses social media to isolate and destroy people. The public shaming and political destruction of women who challenge the status quo is still happening every single day. The tactics are just more sophisticated. These four women were not just historical figures. They were archetypes: the pawn, the scandal, the rebel, and the inconvenient survivor. Their stories echo in our modern world, reminding us what happens when authority goes unchecked and paranoia is allowed to rule. If you believe these stories need to be told, and that we have to learn from the past to protect our future, then smash that like button and subscribe for more hidden stories that reveal the truth about power. They were queens, countesses, and scholars. But in the end, they were women that the men in power decided to delete. Let's make sure they are never forgotten.